So in this lesson, we are going to do the practical of OAuth and OIDC like we discussed. Again, a pretty long chapter or long lesson, but at the end of the day, you can get a job just by doing this in this particular lesson. Whatever we are doing in this particular lesson is kind of a job ready thing. A lot of people can get job just by doing this. It's like the core of the identity management of any platform for that matter. Identity and access management, application security, API security. All this is covered from bottom up from this particular perspective. So take your break, it's a long one, and pay attention. Watch again, ask questions, try the sample yourself. All those things I recommend. Without further introduction, let's get into the chapter. So this is the code of the application we are going to look at. In fact, the code is a couple of dozens of lines, but the good thing is that we don't have to look into the whole application itself. We are going to focus on only the authentication and authorization part of this code, the OAuth and OIDC part of it. That part itself is like probably 10 or 12 lines of code effectively, but at the end of the day, it has its own complication. The first thing to note here is that this is a web application, which means that it is going to listen on a port and it is going to listen for HTTP traffic or HTTPS traffic. In this case, it is just HTTP, but in a production scenario, it will be HTTPS. Now, being said that, let's see what the application is going to do. So like any other web application, when you start this application, it will pop up a browser and you can access the application through browser because it is going to listen on a port for HTTP traffic. And then it has different routes like this. Basically handlers. When people try to access the home page, what happens? That is this part of the code. So if you have something called access token inside session, which I'll explain, it displays this particular HTML file. And if there is access token, it'll display this particular code right here. So that is what this part of the code is doing, the handlers. Basically, this is a handler for the root directory or the local host which we are going to access. As I mentioned before, there'll be a lot of new things for you in this particular code, especially if you're not familiar with web development. If you're not used to, say, for example, HTML or web application in general, this is all gonna look very strange to you. I refer you to my networking training to feel a little more comfortable with this kind of things. Now, another route we are handling here is that, or URL. You can think of this as a URL. We are handling here is this particular URL. So this URL is being called by the identity provider. In fact, identity provider will redirect from the browser itself. So the browser automatically call into this particular URL. We'll put breakpoint in all these particular application throughout to see the different flow. And finally, we are accessing the resources. This is the resource location. In the end, we will be accessing this resource location and we have something called access token by that time. So basically, we have only 3 functions in this particular code. If you look, we have only 3 functions. In fact, we have 4 functions. We have something called set tenant ID. So that is a URL right here. So what I recommend to you is that have a look through the code if you're planning to follow through this session before we continue. And like I mentioned before, if you're completely new to web application and web development and Python and all sorts of things, I recommend skip this particular lesson because this is not going to be one of the easiest of lessons in this particular training. So it has a lot of transactions and flows, etc. So let me go through line by line. So we have a couple of imports here. Probably the main import, what matters is this particular import right here, MSAL. So it is a library from Microsoft to handle the authentication and authorization using OIDC. And a couple of places we are using it like so. So we are creating a confidential client application. So get to it. And this is the Flask application. So the Flask is the framework we are using for the server part of the HTTP, which is a Python framework, basically to handle the HTTP server traffic. That is the use of this particular Python library. So we have the concept of a request and session. Session is something we will be discussing here, but if you have question on request and things like that, I recommend my networking training, and we will not be dealing a lot of details here. So the other imports are typical Python imports, nothing specific to this particular application. Again, this is Flask specific secret key and things like that. This is for some kind of encryption Flask is doing to encrypt the session data. Not very important for this particular discussion. And this is where the important thing comes up. The client ID and client secret. And then there is an authority URL. So remember I mentioned this particular application is known to the identity provider. What that means is that the identity provider, which is Microsoft in this case, we have done something within the Microsoft platform, the identity platform, the Entra ID platform, to make this particular application known to it. So we have created an application in the Microsoft portal, and we obtained this client ID and client secret, especially the client secret. Now let's do that. Let's get this thing done before we progress. So line number 11, 12, and 13. So what we are going to do is we are going to create a client and obtain this client ID and secret. We will not be changing the code because I have already created a client. We'll be using that client, but I'll show you how to create a client inside the Microsoft platform and how to obtain this particular thing right here. So we'll understand how to make an application known in the OAuth or OIDC flow. So here I have logged into the Azure portal or the identity providers portal. In this case, could be any identity provider. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to search for app, and inside that, I'm going to select app registration. So basically, this is how you introduce an application, a piece of code to the identity provider. Basically, we are creating an entity as an application. Now, what are the objectives of this? The objective is to get a client credentials and connect that client credentials with a set of permissions. That's what we are going to do here. So this is similar to your ChatGPT or DeepSeek R1 or any other application using Microsoft or Google or Facebook authentication. So we have an application which we don't want to handle the authentication and authorization. To onboard that application into the identity provider, you need to create an instance of that application within the identity provider, and that's the step we are in right now. Now, click on New Registration, and we can give any name, test app reg 1. And here we have a couple of options here. If you look, account in this organizational directory. This is kind of limiting the amount or the type of identity this particular application is going to support. Do we have Gmail here? No, we don't. Do we have Facebook here? No, we don't. Now, what are the options we have? Account in this organizational directory, which means it is private to some kind of organization, a bank, or a hospital, or a company. Within that company, any other credentials is not going to work. Your Gmail is going to work? No, it is not going to work. Your Facebook is going to work? No, it is not going to work. All right, so that is pretty restrictive. That's not what we want. How about this? Any Entra ID tenant. This is the default directory. This is Entra ID, different type of IDs or users. And this is what we are going to select. Account in any organizational directory along with Microsoft account. And that's precisely what we are going to use. Just a Microsoft account, Skype, Live ID, etc. Suppose if we had something called Gmail here, we'll be able to use Gmail for this particular application to authenticate. Suppose if we had Facebook here, we'll be able to use Facebook user authentication for this particular application. But what we are doing is Microsoft Entra ID, and this is what it supports. Now, another important thing here is that what kind of application this is. We'll see what this is later, but in our application, once the authentication happens, we are redirecting to a particular URL. Say let's put it http://localhost. We'll see that later. /auth/test callback with code and then token. Any URL you can mention, provided this is there in your application. We'll see that in our example. This application we will not be using for our example. I'm just showing you how to create something like this. This can be any URL. If it is localhost, it'll allow HTTP, otherwise it'll allow only HTTPS. And there are a couple of other options, single page application, native client, and things like that. I feel this whole thing deserves its own training to show you all the options and the implications of that options. But for the time being, we are simply going to create a register. Now the app is registered or the entity has created. So we have an ID, object ID, and things like that. Click on manage. We'll get further options. And what I'm interested is client certificate and secret, or certificate and secrets right here. So this will allow a piece of code like the one we have seen to create an instance of this application and to do the bidding of this particular application, whatever permission this application is going to have. So that is where this client secrets is going to come up. So we have created this entity and we are going to create a new client secret. I'm going to put a test1. We can put the expiry of that secret. I'm going to put the default 180 days, and I'm going to add that to the application registration. As you can see, we got a secret and its value right here. We can copy this and we can copy this particular value. And that is the value we have seen in the code right here. The client ID is there and the client secret. Now, another important thing I'd like to show you is the API permission. Now, our code is going to give the client ID and secret, and then the user will authenticate to this application via Entra ID or the Microsoft logon. Now, what permission it is going to get? What is the final permission of that access token which we are going to obtain? That is what we are going to mention here. What permission this application will have in the target? That is what we are going to mention here. So it will ask the user whether this particular application is allowed to access these permissions. So this is where the OAuth really comes into the picture. Role-based access control. Access to what? Access to these things. That is what the user will give the end user, the owner of the resource. Owner can pretty much access everything. When you log into ChatGPT using Gmail or any other application using Gmail, Gmail will ask XYZ things I'm going to give to this particular application. Do you allow or not? That XYZ thing is what we are going to mention here. What this application really wants once everything is said and done. So very careful mentioning this thing. If you mention too many permissions, the user may reject. too less, the application may not work. So those are the trade-offs. Enough permission should be mentioned here to the right resources, right APIs, depending on the scenario you are accessing here. There are so many other options here. We don't have time to go into such things. Probably I'll take another training just for Microsoft Entra ID or any other identity provider. But the important things we have looked up on: the certificate or the secret and the API permission. And of course, the callback URL we have seen, where the callback will come once the authentication is successful. Feel free to pause the video, and if you want to read through this, some of these small descriptions are very useful and very self-explanatory, and you can learn more about it. Anyhow, we are going to see in our example. Now I'm going to delete this application, and this application we won't be using it. Instead of that, this application will be using it. Reason is nothing but I've been playing around with it and I don't want to change all the endpoints and things like that, the keys and stuff. So I'm just going to delete to avoid any kind of confusion. And before we go into the code, I'll just show you the one we will be using. And these are the value of the secret. The secret value you need to copy for the first time. After that, you won't be able to access it. So it is starting with 6SL. As you can see here, that is a key. I have mentioned the client secret. Now, if you go and look at the overview, this is the client ID, and that is the client ID we have mentioned here. This is pretty common. Login.microsoftonline.com. That is the identity provider here. Now let's get back to the code. So the first place the user will be coming is this particular location right here once the application starts. We have seen this before. And of course, there won't be any access token in this session when we start, because there is no authentication has been done or authorization has been done. Access token is the token we get in the extreme end of this whole flow. So this is not there. So we will be executing this in the beginning, or we have to execute this in the beginning. Now let's have a quick look at this HTML. The first HTML user will see. So it is printing some stuff, and it is taking an input from the user called tenant ID with a submit button. So what it is doing is it is taking the tenant ID. You can think of it like your Gmail address. Similar to that, which Microsoft account you want to use. That is what the tenant ID is all about. So in Microsoft Azure, which is what we are trying to access, the end user is trying to access, or the application, this application is trying to access someone's Microsoft Azure account. That is the end goal we are trying to achieve. Now, which account? That's what we are going to mention here. So ultimately, this particular piece of code will bring us the tenant ID, basically the account to which we need to log in. That is a target resource we are trying to access through the whole process. Now, where we're gonna put this tenant ID? To this particular function right here, set tenant ID. That's where we're gonna put this particular tenant ID when we get that tenant ID from the end user or the resource owner. And that function is right here. So whenever someone comes to this particular URL of this particular web application, it is going to execute this particular function right here. So we are getting the tenant ID here. It is a global variable right here because we'll be using in other functions. We're printing the tenant ID, and this is one of the critical steps which is happening right here. Confidential client application. So we are creating a confidential client application using the tenant ID. Let's see what are the arguments we are passing. We are passing the client ID and client secret, then the authority URL with the tenant ID. So these are the things we are passing to create the confidential client application. So what is this confidential client application? So the idea here is that this particular piece of code has no connection at the moment until this line number 24, this particular line right here. this particular piece of code has no connection with that application registration we have done in the Azure Entra portal, the previous step we have done. This is the connection. This is a line which is connecting that entity we have created just before, the client application registration, and this code running inside this Visual Studio code right here. Very important point to understand here. This particular line right here. Again, what are the things we are passing? This is obtained from that registration we have done. Again, this is also from the registration we have done. This is a public URL, which is this particular login.microsoftonline.com. Nothing specific about it, but we are passing the tenant ID. We are selecting what we really need to access. So it returns this particular object. Internally, it might be calling some APIs to verify this client secret and the target, what that client can potentially do accessing this tenant ID. Now what happens? Now, next is another important thing. We are getting a URL. Okay, so we got the confidential client application. Can we get access to the owner's resource with that? Absolutely no. Because we are not passing any owner details here. The ultimate owner details is not here. The username and password of the owner. Who is the owner? Owner is the guy who has access to this particular tenant ID. This is his account. Like I said, it could be a Gmail of a particular person. This is the Gmail ID equivalent. Now, are we taking the username and password of the Gmail right here? No, we are not. We are simply authenticating the application itself who want access to the Gmail, or in this case, the tenant ID. Very important point. If you miss this point, you'll be confused throughout this session. I can guarantee you that. Very important point. Now, what is the next step? Now we need to collect the username and password from the user to access this particular tenant ID. So this is the ultimate resource we need to access. We need to get those steps. Remember, the user is never going to share his username and password with this particular application right here, app.py. Never ever. That's a whole point of this exercise. Very important point to notice. Now what we are going to do? We are going to get an authorization request URL. Get authorization request URL. We are using that particular CCA right here, and we are mentioning something called scope. So this is all about limiting the permission of the token which we are going to get. Doesn't really matter to us, but scope is one of the important parameters we are passing to the authorization URL. Based on the scope, the URL can be different. Now, what we are going to do, we are going to redirect the browser. So this is a web server, remember, always. This particular code you are seeing right here is running inside a web server. Remember that. Very important point to notice. Now, what is line number 28 is doing? Line number 28 is a redirecting. So it is an HTTP redirect to this particular URL. So the browser will go to this particular URL automatically. And this is going to be a Microsoft URL. URL provided by the identity provider. In this case, it is going to be Microsoft. So what is this call is doing? We are asking Microsoft, hey Microsoft, please give me the URL to which I want the user to be redirected so that the user can securely enter the username and password. That's what we are trying to do here. Very important to notice. Now after this, what user will see is his Azure login page or whatever he used to log into his Azure. And once he does that, he will get the next prompt to allow this application to access a particular resource. Now, before we get into the access token part, what we can do is that we can execute the application and see all these things in action so that we'll have clarity on what we are trying to do here. So to run this application, it's fairly straightforward. Just like any other Python file, you can simply run from the Python, then the file name. In this case, what we are going to do is that we are going to put breakpoint pretty much everywhere and we're going to debug this whole thing. So I have a breakpoint right here in the home, which is the root, and I have a breakpoint right here in the auth callback, and then I have a breakpoint right here in the resources as well. So this callback is not very important for us because this callback happens after all the security measures have been taken. After a successful authentication, that's when this particular callback happens. There's a step involved in getting the subscription ID. This is specific to this particular application workflow. This is actually doing a proper application workflow. This is like a proof of concept of something else which I'm showing you. The subscription ID is also not very related to what we are discussing, but I'll shortly discuss about it because I'll be sharing this particular code with you in case you were wondering what it is. That's not something worth discussing for us because we are looking at only the security part of this particular code. So we have breakpoint on auth callback. It's a very important breakpoint. And of course we have breakpoint on the home screen, which you see slash, and then the set tenant ID, we have breakpoint. The tenant ID is initialized to null or empty string. Now, in my case, I'm going to start debugging. I won't be getting any breakpoint in the initial run because none of this code is getting executed. So the first thing I'm going to do is after starting the server, which is started in the Visual Studio Code, I'm going to access this particular URL, localhost 5000. That is where the server by default starts. And as you can see here, I got this one particular breakpoint hit. If you have any confusion around all this debugging which I'm doing, feel free to refer to my Python training. This is all discussed in there. If you're using something else other than Visual Studio Code to develop Python, and if you're not familiar with debugging, I really recommend my Python training. Being said that, so I'm going to step through this particular instruction. Access token not in session. So that is the condition we are checking. Whether this particular thing has, this particular dictionary has an object or a key called access token. At the moment it doesn't because we have not saved anything to the session called access token so far. So what it is going to do, it is going to show this particular page which we are discussing before. If you want, you can simply save this to a text file and view as HTML, but it's all going to be the same thing. So this is what we are going to see in the screen right now when I press this go button, continue. So I'm going to press this go button, or I can press this particular step over button and execute that statement. It's up to you how you want to do it. And if I go back to my browser, I can see that particular window is displayed here. Now I need to enter the tenant ID. I do have a correct tenant ID. So this is the target account number or the target account tenant ID to which I'm trying to access the resources of. This is the target. This is what I'm trying to get at. Now I'm going to click the submit button. So what is the handler of the submit button? We have seen that this is the handler of the submit button, this particular function. So I'm expecting this particular breakpoint to hit right now when I press that button. So I'm putting this ID here and going to click this particular button right here. 1, 2, and 3. As you can see, the browser is gonna wait. If you can see here, it is revolving round and round and round, which means that it is waiting for the server. Where is the server? Server is listening on this particular computer right here on port 5000. Server is right here. Where is the server? Server is this. And as I was expecting, this particular breakpoint has hit because the URL we are trying to get at is the set tenant ID. Let's see that in the browser. It is not changed in the browser. Only if you let this thing go, it'll change there because the browser is currently waiting for the server to respond. Now let's have a quick look. We are going to debug. So request form.get. If you're familiar with web development, you know exactly what it is. Nothing complicated here. We are taking the request and inside the request there is a web form and we are getting the tenant ID from that web form. This is all bread and butter of a web development. If you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. We are just getting the tenant ID we entered in that box of the browser. The browser did an HTTP post request. HTTP post request. And this web server is handling that HTTP post request. Very typical HTTP scenario. Always happens this kind of request. Even while we are listening to this particular training, you are doing post request. Now, let's see if we are getting the tenant ID correctly here. I'm going to press the button. We are indeed getting the tenant ID. Feel free to look into these objects if you want. You can add to watch. In fact, if you want, you can refer to any object for that matter. I really encourage you to look into different objects which is coming up. As you can see, the request is coming on this particular URL right here. And it has form. Inside form, you will see the tenant ID. This is the tenant ID we are trying to access. The full path of the form and all the information about the request is right here. Cookies you can view here. Typical HTTP request. And we are printing the tenant ID. And then we are doing that thing we discussed before. Creating the confidential client application. So we'll look into this object a little more detail. Let's get that object created. So that's what we are going to do. We are going to create that object. We are going to make a Microsoft call. If you want, you can turn on your fiddler here to see a couple of Microsoft calls made behind the scenes. But I don't want to go into that level of details here. I'm not going to turn on my fiddler. I have my fiddler right here, but I'm not capturing anything. I have done my capture before. But if you are curious what is this particular thing is doing behind the scenes, internals of this particular implementation. In fact, it is open source. If you are that curious, you can turn on Fiddler. In fact, it is calling a couple of APIs behind the scenes, Microsoft REST APIs behind the scenes to get this particular object created. Again, it's very Microsoft specific. That's why I don't want to go into the details of it. And I don't want to deviate from our major discussion. The session is already too complicated and too big. So I'm going to assume that it's the magic Microsoft does behind the scenes and confidential client application is going to get created when I press this particular button. And that's exactly what happened. This particular object has been created. Let's have a look into the object and watch. I'll just pull this particular window a little to the left so that we can have a better look into this particular object. So there's a lot of fields, interesting fields. It has a client credentials. So the client credentials is there. The client ID is there. So there are more fields and more objects inside it. Now, if you look into the object, you will see a couple of interesting fields right here within the client. So there is a client object right here within the CCA object. And inside that, you will see some configuration right here. And there is authorization endpoint, token endpoint, and a couple of different interesting fields right here. So we'll have a look once we get the authorization request URL. We'll see one of these fields and compare it with what we are getting here. Now what we are getting the URL to which the browser to be redirected to. That's what we are going to get at. I'm going to press F10 again and we got the URL. So the auth URL, so copy as value. I'm going to put that into a notepad and now I'm going to copy this particular field. As you can see, the start is exactly same. So there is this GUID coming up right here. Then OAuth 2, v2.0 authorize. Then we have the client ID. And there are some scope and other things. There is no secret other than the client ID. Pretty much this URL is essentially this particular URL right here with the client ID and some additional details. So I don't think to create this, it is making an additional call. You can check that in Fiddler if you want, but otherwise it looks straightforward to me. Now the thing is that if you access this particular thing, this is a very stateless HTTP redirection. If you access this particular thing from anywhere, you will go to the same place, which is what we are going to see in the browser anyway. So this is a very stateless. If you copy this and paste it into a web browser, it'll go to the same place. You can try that, but in my case, I'm just going to press the play button or the F10 so that the debugger won't be confused. I want this application to run when the callback comes, because the callback, next is the callback we are expecting, this callback right here. This is the callback we are expecting. I'll explain how this callback comes to this particular application. We may have to get into the Blackboard for that, because that's slightly confusing if I don't explain it using Blackboard. Right now, I'm going to run the server. The application is going to get run. Right now it is broken into the debugger and it is running right now. Let's see what is happening in the browser corresponding. As you can see, the browser has redirected. I have already logged into this particular account. That's why it is not asking me all the permissions again. What I can do is that I can repeat this thing so that this is an in private window. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to close this and I'll repeat this so that all my existing login will go. And you can see it from the very beginning, the flow, what happens when that particular URL, this is a URL we are trying to access. It's the same URL we have seen in that notepad. So I'll just close this window and I will repeat everything so that there is no existing login. So I'm going to enter the tenant ID again, came here. I'm going to press the play button so that it will redirect. And this time it is going fresh into my Microsoft login. I wanted to show this particular page because previously, as I have already logged in, it was skipping this particular stage. And this particular page right here, it's nothing to do with the application. This is not localhost anymore. This is the most important part here. And I'm going to type my username and password here. And that username and password is my Microsoft Azure username and password. So the owner, I'm the resource owner here. And the resource owner is going to enter the username and password, which will work for that particular resource, which I'm going to share with that application right here. So this is the third-party application, whatever we are dealing with, the Android ID application. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to share my Azure resources to this particular application. Very important to understand what's going on here. Now, let me enter my credentials. So this is my Azure credentials. I'm typing my username and password and I'm clicking yes, and it is going to my multi-factor authentication. Very important point to notice here. So a simple application, I'm trying to authenticate a simple application to my account, and it is going through all security process which is required to get into the account, and it is all happening inside the identity provider. I'm not sharing my username and password or credentials or OTP. For example, this has sent an OTP right now. This OTP I'm not going to share with that application. I don't trust that application. I trust Microsoft because Microsoft is my identity provider. So I'm going to put the code here so that my login will complete my multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to verify. And now this is the most important thing, probably second most important thing. Now I have authenticated. What is next? Now it is asking me the real stuff. There is an application called SL Test App 1 trying to get into your account, whether you want to allow or not. And the application is unverified, which means that Microsoft has not verified. So there is a verification process which we have not followed. So that is whole different discussion. Unverified application. So where this particular string is coming from? This string is coming from that place where we created that application in the very beginning, the registration we have done. Now, if you cancel, your authentication will fail, and if you accept, it'll succeed, and it'll create a temporary application in this particular account right here. to which you are authenticating into. So for example, this is another browser I have created. As you can see here, this is that account to which we are trying to get into. And inside that, I have enterprise application right here. Now, when I click accept there in the previous window, there will be an additional application going to come here in this particular list. Why? Because it remembers, this account will remember the application to which I'm going to give permission. For example, you have accessed ChatGPT using your Google account. The first time when you do it, the Google will ask you whether ChatGPT is allowed to access your Google details. Next time, once you allow it, next time it will not ask you. It will directly use and go into the ChatGPT login. If you want, you can try it with a new account in ChatGPT or DeepSeek or any other Google authentication application you're using. That is exactly what is going to happen here. So this account has to remember that particular piece. So let's see that. Now I'm going to accept it. By the way, this is a different account. So there are two accounts. Don't get confused. The first account we have seen is the source account where the application itself got registered. That's a different Azure account. And this is the target account you're seeing right now. And in that, as you can see, let me refresh this. There is no SL test application. There is no test application right here as of now. And this is the source account where the SL test application is there. So don't get confused. And this is the source account where the application is present. This is the email ID for that. And this is the target account where this particular email ID is present. Very important. Don't get confused. Now I'm going to click accept. So the accept has done. Now let's go on a refresh this particular page here. As you can see, a new application has created just now. Very important point to notice here. And this application will have some of the details which we have in the other account. Now, another important thing here is that we got another breakpoint in our web application. Let's see what's going on in the browser. So this is our browser. The browser is waiting. As you can see, the browser is waiting for the backend. So something is processed. Okay, let's understand what's happening here. So we clicked accept here in this button, and the whole authentication flow is successful. Now this particular page right here has redirected us to this particular URL right here, which is localhost :5000/auth callback. So how did we know? How did this page know it has to redirect to this particular page? So if you remember, so this is where all the complication comes. So if you remember, we have done that when we configured this particular application in our source account. We had this particular field we filled up. If you look here, after authentication, after successful authentication or even failure authentication, where we should give the tokens and the code, all those things here, this URL right here. And that's exactly what happened here. This breakpoint has hit, which is the handler of this particular URL. And now what we have, it's all numbers. We've gone through a huge, big authentication workflow. I entered my username and password. I entered my OTP, the one-time password, and then I allowed the amount of things to be accessed by this particular application. I did approve that workflow. And what is the end result? I'm going to get particular numbers. This particular application is supposed to get some numbers. Let's see that. So it is checking code in request args. So it is looking for a specific code. Let's see that code. So this is that code. This is also called authorization code. Authorization code is a OAuth or OIDC terminology. So authorization code is an input to get the access token. So what we got is an authorization code when the user approved all the requests for this particular application. Now, what this application is going to do with that code is going to get an access token. And that's what is exactly happening here. CCA, we are using that client object, confidential client object. Acquire token by authorization code. Very important. What we are acquiring? We are acquiring a access token. This token is the access token. What we have? Authorization code. Where is the authorization code? It is inside this right here. Okay, let's do that. We are going to get that. And we got the authorization code. And we got the authorization access token from the authorization code. Very important to notice. So I'm going to print that access token. So this is a JSON web token or JWT token. So let's copy this, copy value. And this is very similar to the SAML token we have been seeing in the previous lesson. This token is encrypted in the sense that there is an encrypted hash inside this token which can be verified just like we have seen before. And any tampering of this token can be detected. Now let's parse this token and let's find out what is the content of it. To parse a token, you can go to any website which does the token parsing. You can search for JWT token parsing, parser or parsing. So a lot of these websites comes up. I'm just going to select a random one and I'm going to paste our token right here. As you can see here, we can see the decounted JWT. Pretty much this is nothing but JSON formatted text which is base 64 encoded. Nothing fancy about it. Don't get afraid seeing all this weird looking text. It's all just normal text which is base 64 encoded. And these dots are also part of this JWT. You will see one more dot. If you want, you can research more on the JWT format, but nothing fancy about it. It's just a normal base 64 encoded JSON, but otherwise this is the content of it. Very simple and straightforward things. Let's have a look at the important stuff. This is the algorithm RSA 256. It is using RSA algorithm. Very familiar to us. We have learned everything about RSA. You should be a master in RSA by now. If not, watch the previous lessons. Everything is boiling down to basics from now onwards. The algorithm used for signing the JWT. We have seen all the signatures, everything we have seen. Password and multi-factor authentication. There's my email and my name. It has all the details. It is giving all the details. Live.com, that is the identity provider. ITP. Even the name is similar, exactly same as SAML. This is interesting. It is stealing my IP address and giving to the application, which is something which I don't like. But at the end of the day, that is what it is doing. But we have not seen the important bit, which is the signature. Let's see the signature. Unfortunately, this is not showing the signature, which was the most important bit. It is just showing me the payload. We need a better parser. So I don't recommend this particular parser. So I have gone to another parser, which is this. I don't know how it'll be looking when you will be looking at it. Right now it is showing me the signature as well. So this is the header, this green. Remember I was mentioning about two dots. So this is the header and this blue part is the payload and the final part is the signature. So this is the header part of it. And we have seen the payload with all the details right here with my IP address. This is my IP address. Now it is not even parsing the signature, but it's saying the signature is in the end. As you can see, this is the signature. I would recommend both of this thing. If you want the signature, you need to look at the other one or something different. But one good thing about this is it is explaining each and every field. The field, value, and explanation, which is a good read. Algorithm used for signing the JWT, the signature. So we have seen the digital signature part. So this is the algorithm which is used, which is RSA. So that part is there. So at the end of the day, long story short, the token we got, the access token, is very similar to the SAML token, just that it is in a different format. SAML token was in XML, but JWT token we got in the end of an auth flow is nothing but a JSON token. Otherwise, it has a signature to find out the tampering, and it is signed by, who has signed it in this case? Of course, Microsoft. So Microsoft has signed it, and there's a way of verifying the public key, and the private key is within Microsoft. Rest of the flow is all about using this token. If you look at the code, I'm not going to comment this code too much. I'll see if I can clean it up before I post it for you. But the rest of the flow is all about, so let me keep this application going so that I will get a breakpoint here. So the access token is present. So if the access token is present, what we're going to do here is we are going to resources. As you can see here, we are going to resources with something called subscription ID. So let's go to the UI. So there is a subscription ID we need. I'm going to select a subscription ID, and we are not going to do anything with it, to be honest, because our auth is done. We got the access token, we got it in cookie. So we are keeping the access token inside the cookie. And the subscription ID is another Azure related thing. Doesn't matter. No more auth stuffs are happening. Tenant ID we already got, and we are going to use this access token, this token right here, and we are going to access different Azure resources from this application. So this application is going to access that target account using this particular token right here, the JWT token. So that is the flow of the whole thing. Feel free to visit again. Use Fiddler if you want. Debug this application. I'll try to clean it up. Probably I'll clean this subscription ID and things like that. But never wonder what you're doing with this access token. This access token will give permission to access the resource in that account. You can call Azure APIs with this access token, which is what happening the rest of the script we are executing. A PowerShell and things like that for some kind of assessment and stuff. But once you have this access token, you're already within the account. So that is the overall flow of OIDC and OAuth. Very similar to SAML. Now, let's try to get into the diagram once again. So this may sound like a bit of a repeat of something we have seen. So we have the web browser right here. So this is the web browser, WB. In our case, it was a Chrome web browser. And we have the Visual Studio Code with our web server. So we have the web server and the Visual Studio Code. Then the almighty Microsoft IDP, the IDP. Now we had the source account. Source account. This is an Azure account. Source Azure account. Then finally, the target Azure account. Target AZ. So these were the entities more or less we've been playing with. And of course, I'm here, the user, the owner of this particular account. Let me draw myself in a different color so that I will look different, because I'm the owner of this particular account right here, green. So I'm the guy who has the God level access to this particular account right here. Now what? Now who wants access? This guy right here. He is the guy who wants access. Who is this guy? He is just an application developed by someone, not necessarily me. More than often it is not me. Does he need full access to this particular account? No, he doesn't need full access. He needs only limited access. Remember that window which came after the logon? There was a window in which we accepted with the name of the application was there. In that window, there was a list of all the permissions which are giving to that particular application. So those are the permissions in this account this application will get. Now, where is the workflow starting? The workflow was starting within this account. In this account, what we did, we created an application SL test. So we have created this application right here and made sure that the IDP is aware about it. At the end of the day, these all things are connected. These are all Microsoft objects. We have created this particular application right here in this particular account. And then we have shared some credentials here, right here. Shared some client credentials. And using that client credentials, we have created an object within the IDP. I'm pretty sure there is connection between these two things in that matter, but it is kind of transparent to us. So we have created a CCA object. Before that, we got the tenant ID, the ID of this particular account from the user, which is me, AG. AG has given the tenant ID, TID. AG has given the tenant ID to the application. And the application, along with the other things, it has created the CCA client, confidential client application. It has created with the help of IDP and of course this particular account right here. Now, almost everything we have done using the CCA thingy. We have requested, once that is created, we have requested an authorization URL or a specific URL, and we redirected the browser to that URL. And that URL is all the way going to here. Remember, that is where we got that login prompt where I entered my username and credentials. So we requested the URL. So this is URL request. And we got the URL from the IDP URL. We don't care this particular connection is there or not. Probably it was there within this object or not. Doesn't matter. What matters is we have redirected the client. Let me draw it in a different color so that is what really matters. This blue line is what matters. We are redirecting the web browser right here. The web browser right here to that URL, the Microsoft logon URL. Along with the logon, it is asking the permission and a lot of other things it is doing. Now we have redirected to that URL right here. Now what happens? A lot of back and forth between these two guys. This guy is not present. Let me draw that a bit more seriously because this guy is continuing right here like this. It's continuing right here. So once the URL is present, a lot of back and forth. So this round here means that this guy is not involved. This guy is not involved in this whole thing. Complete bypass. Username and password. OTP. There was OTP. Gone. This guy is not seeing any of those things. Then final, the permission being asked. Again, that guy is not present. The permission, the third and final step. The permission, whether this application called XYZ is trying to access your account, whether you need to allow or not. And once everything is given to this guy, what happens? Everything is given to this guy. This guy is happy. The authorization is allowed. Now what happens? Let me draw that other thing as well so that it'll come right here. Now this guy is telling this browser to redirect to this. In this process, it is given a code, authorization code it has given. It is different from access token. Authorization code is different from access token. This code is right here. It is given by the IDP to the browser and it is redirecting to this particular URL. What is this URL? This is that auth callback URL which we have configured when we created this thing right here. So essentially you can think of these two entities are very much connected. I would like to call it as IDP, the whole thing, but it's a different Azure account. Probably you can think of it is the same entity. For example, the application has been configured here. So the callback URL, we got it. And then what this guy will do, using the callback URL, it is getting the access token. What was the API called? CCA.getAccessToken by authorization code. Something like that. I forgot, but you know what I mean. It is calling the API and getting the access token for accessing this particular account right here. Now, once it has the access token, it has access to this particular account right here, the final step. So that's what we have seen so far. And we looked at the authorization access token, the JWT access token. We have decrypted the token decoded, decrypted is not the correct term, decoded the token, and we have seen that particular JWT token. This is a typical OAuth OIDC workflow. We've been using it all through our life so far. Whenever you try to access an application using Facebook or Instagram or Google account, this is what happens. Today itself I used this. I was authenticating to GitHub. I used GitHub username and password for GitHub Copilot. I used it today. Just today I used this particular workflow. So very common, very important, very complicated in the beginning. Once you get a hang of it, it's pretty straightforward, exactly like SAML. If SAML is making sense to you, this should make sense as well. So to conclude, we have seen the flow of an OIDC auth, different token handlings, different entities present in each flow we have discussed. If you're into corporate security, this is probably one of the most important topic. In any big companies, this is implemented. This has to be implemented one way or the other. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, we can discuss. I have given the sample for you to test and do the demo yourself. If you have any issues, as usual, reach out. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next.